Hi, everyone. This is poster 50, Cultivating New Platform Imaginaries to Connect Open Data and Social Justice. To start, let me introduce ourselves. The four authors, Amanda, Anjali, Gulsen, and I, Shreyasha, came together last summer as part of a workshop organized by CIVIC Software Foundation. This paper is a product of our work during the workshop and our reflections after it. As the title suggests, the main idea behind this paper is for a new imaginary to connect open data and social justice. But before getting into that, let's start with a provocation. Open washing demands our attention. So we claim that open data is built on some unsteady assumption. The first one is data is truth. Most open data advocates assume data is neutral, independent from social, political, economic forces, and therefore the data should be driver of all decisions for social change. The second assumption is that data is capital. As the picture here shows, data is the new oil. We've all heard of it in one form or another. And in this version, data is considered as raw material to be extracted. And when it is available, it can be used by anyone. These assumptions lead a lot of us to believe that more data is always better, and the amount of data that is published is often used as a measure for transparency. This is what we call open washing. Open washing is basically data dumping with little to no consideration on what the data means, what biases might be embedded, or who might use this data for what purpose. And this version of open washing leads to a vicious cycle. We assume data is neutral, so we collect data without examining any assumptions. This data might encode existing inequalities. As we all know, society is unequal. And then we use this, publish and encourage use of this data for what is deemed objective decisions. As a result, the data then perpetuates more inequalities. In pointing this out, we are not rejecting the value or benefits that come from data, but we are calling for an imaginary where we move past the assumption of neutral or objective data. And I hand over to Amanda.
So we basically believe that context is one key to changing this data deterministic imaginary that the open data movement currently relies on. And we define context as the situated knowledge from which a data set is created and abstracted from. So it's a comprehensive background of everything that has gone into the inception, creation, collection, et cetera, of a data set. And this notion of situated knowledge is not our idea. We are relying on sort of a rich history of feminist theorists such as Sandra Harding and Donna Haraway, who coined this idea of situated knowledge. They also call it strong objectivity or feminist objectivity, to sort of stress that it's not just extra fluff, but actually is a way of being more rigorous with your data. So their work in general stresses the need to see knowledge as emerging from particular socio-historical contexts and human standpoints, drawing attention to the fact that certain standpoints are given more authority to create knowledge than others. And in their recent Data Feminism, Ignacio and Klein have explained that situated knowledge is a way of getting to the truth. It's, quote, a form of objectivity that works toward more inclusive knowledge production by centering the perspective or standpoints of groups that are otherwise excluded from knowledge-making processes. And especially since, as Gittleman has influentially noted, data is an oxymoron, it highlights how data is produced and the absences in those data. And Noah says, understanding that the absences are significant because what we ignore reveals just as much, if not more, than what we give our attention to. So there have been attempts to move from theory into practice, even though they haven't always been explicitly sort of framed in terms of context. At one sort of first level of intervention, organizations such as the Urban Institute have developed tools for assessing biases that are embedded in existing open data sets. But there have also been a number of initiatives at the governmental level that demonstrate a commitment to making data more accessible and transparent. In the US, for example, the city governments of New York City and Detroit are two particularly compelling examples. New York City's project, begun in 2017, focuses on reducing data poverty. in order to achieve, quote, open data for all. And Detroit partnered with the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition and the Detroit Community Technology Project to bring activists and community stakeholders into the conversation about how the city should deal with open data. While really admirable, these have mostly been revamping the platforms to make them more accessible and not necessarily rethinking the way data is collected and presented. So the most ambitious work has been led by activist groups such as Data for Black Lives. Their portal contains detailed information about why and how data was collected, as well as the place of data as a tool for social justice. Their work is a really clearly important model that fosters accountability and social justice by making context concrete, though of course such efforts are labor intensive and difficult to scale. We believe context is key because it can be immediately directly visible in existing technological structures, which I think Gulsen is going to tell us more about.
Yeah. So we heard some of the work that already exists and going on in this area of context, and now we want to introduce our intervention. It aims to break the silos and help create a shared language and practices. This intervention is called structured context. With this intervention, we aim to shift the platform imaginary and support open data in ways that can combat the dominance of extractive models that undermine true accountability. Context can be embedded in data systems with metadata, can be overlaid on data visualizations, or can be its own source of knowledge. So in this way, structured context is a multi-layer methodology that grows organically. The first layer is context in a structured form. In this sense, structured context is a tool that is computer readable, reusable, and easily shareable and accessible metadata. If we move to the next slide, this metadata schema has two pieces. First, there is foundational context, which is for understanding and capturing the production of the dataset. The second piece is transformational context, alluding the cultural shift that can occur once this practice of structured context metadata is in wider use. This context goes beyond the data lifecycle to capture the impact of a particular data set. This is where we break ground on deeper situated knowledge and lived experience, and where structured context as a form turns into practice. An important note here is that completeness or being done is never the main goal with this metadata schema. The gaps or missing answers allow for larger and more inclusive conversations to emerge in regard to the use of data sets. So structured context as a practice means building a partnership with organized community engagement and institutionally supported data stewardship. It is a non-hierarchical collaborative practice that focuses on trust building. There are two main feedback loops in this process. The first feedback loop is between foundational and transformational context. The terms foundational and transformational might sound like a part of a linear process, but we really do see all these pieces building upon each other continuously. And the second feedback loop is between two main contributing groups of data ecosystems: data constituents, defined by those who are represented in or impacted by the dataset, and domain experts. To coordinate these feedback loops and facilitate the creation of structured context, an intermediary actor is required. However, this intermediary actor must exist outside the current data ecosystem, because as Dignasia and Klein said in their data feminism book, individuals, research teams, and small organizations are already challenged by deadlines and budgets. This intermediary actor is also there to recognize the power dynamics that are present in data ecosystems. And lastly, through this collaborative practice, structured context can become a living artifact and grow in value when connected to the other contextualized data sets, creators, users, and communities. We are aware that structured context will not bring the change alone, but it is rather a place to start the conversation, see the invisible and hidden, understand what falls through the cracks of data categories, and ask questions to demand accountability.
Thanks, Gulsen. So to wrap up and continue forward. With structured context, we recognize that metadata can only do so much to communicate the embedded biases, power hierarchies, historical context, and their impact on every step of the data lifecycle. We want to expand the imaginary to envision structured context in a digital library platform. This can go beyond the traditional hierarchy of metadata members. Structured context in this form can be updated throughout the dataset's life and have contributions from both the data creators and the data constituents. We see this as one step in a broader systemic change. This is not a tool in and of itself to measure transparency or a shortcut to accountability. The actual challenge is not, quote, simply to reimagine infrastructural arrangements, but also the knowledge practices with which they are associated. What truly will connect open data and social justice is not structured context itself, but rather the platform it lives in and the culture created around it. We propose looking to library culture for new platform imaginary that can harness the value of structured context. One attempt of structured context in the practice of library imaginaries can be seen in the program development of the Civic Data Library of Context from the nonprofit Civic Software Foundation based in the US. The two key pillars of this program are one, a new way of working, referring to the structured context creation process between data constituents and data publishers that Gulsen just talked to, and two, a technical product to showcase structured context held in the public domain. The library is not just technical infrastructure, but an imaginary that creates non-hierarchical public sphere that allows for sharing both information and also lived experiences. This opportunity for understanding an authentic connection is essential for acknowledging the limitations of data and what it obscures from the perspective of those who are directly affected by it. It shifts away from a data deterministic approach and toward improving through actionable collaboration with data constituents, for example, by redesigning data collection plans or changing data categories. While acknowledging libraries have a history of acting as gatekeepers of information and knowledge production, contemporary library theory and culture is nevertheless a rich area to mine for inspiration and alternative imaginaries rooted in discovery, communication, and community building. Libraries as platforms, quote, give rise to messy, rich networks of people and ideas, continuously sparked and maintained by the library's resources. Library cultures that sustain structured context in a broader ecosystem will cultivate new platform imaginaries by allowing and coordinating active participation and cataloging of contributors that can add to, amend, access, and or utilize the data, transforming data sets into living entities. The goal is to make this form of knowledge accessible by facilitating new acts of collaboration. So, in essence, this will also be a meeting place, a platform to share and connect, a chance for the stories of the data constituents to interact with the motivations of researchers and other users. Replacing open washing with purposeful and transparent sharing of structured context data, the library platform becomes a place to dismantle systemic societal inequities codified in the data sphere. So, looking ahead and opening the debate with all of you to move us all forward. Because we are willing to pay attention, carefully and critically observe and change, there's hope for the future. Structured context is a reflection opportunity to question and acknowledge the injustices. The work is not done when data is contextualized. It's the total opposite. When data is contextualized, it is one of the first steps of a long journey that will require honesty, commitment, willingness to change, and transparency. So with that, we leave you with questions we hope will help keep moving this discussion and debate forward. I'll read them aloud, and we all look forward to discussing with you during the conference or after. So 1, how would you see structured context applied in your industry or sector? What context is needed in your own work? 2, if we consider context as infrastructure, what other infrastructure is needed to make context work? What can incentivize the investment of time, labor, and money needed to create context? 3, what else is needed to create an ecosystem where context is added every time data is used, and not just when it is created? And 4, the Civic Data Library of Context is encouraging the creation of context. How do we encourage asking for and using context as more as a default? So thank you for listening. Again, I'm Anjali and my colleagues are Shreyasha, Amanda, and Gulsen.